I was reading online about how the DAC can bring a system to life. I had been using my trusty Topping L+E50 stack for a while now, but I thought I'd give something new a try. I just recently sold some headphones, and so I had a little bit of money to play with, and so I picked up the ADI 2 DAC FS. I picked it up used because I buy almost everything used. Yeah, I mean, generally a lot of the equipment, they're very trustworthy, and so they're reliable, and so they last. And so I've never had issues with buying anything used. So yeah, the RME ADI 2 DAC uses the AKM chipset. They do have an ESS version, and the Topping E50 uses the ESS chipset. And before I did some A/B testing, I just spent a few days listening to it, using it as a headphone amp to power my HE1000 Stealth and my Symphonium Crimsons, and using it as DAC on the Echo Mark II to power my Veride closed headphones, and also to power as a DAC on the IEMA A70 to power my Sonos Faber Lumina 2 speakers. And I was impressed. I really liked everything I was listening to. I felt like it came alive a bit more. The bass felt a bit more tactile, a little bit more authoritative, and I felt like it added a little bit more clarity and treble energy, and overall to the spectrum, it felt a little bit more clear. I especially liked it paired with my Echo, and I felt like it was giving it that missing, I don't know, I mean, I actually did not feel like I was missing anything from the E50, but after listening to it, I felt like it was adding that missing 5%, it just got a little bit better. I also played with EQ. For those of you who don't know about the ADI 2 DAC FS, and this is not an in-depth review of this device, but it has a parametric EQ system where I think you can adjust about 5 bands or so. When I played with it, I had just boosted the mids just slightly. I don't know if you can see the graph here, but yeah, I just had that slightly boosted as, oftentimes, the mids are some of my favorite parts of my listening experience. And then now it was time to test if what I was hearing was complete placebo or if there was really something to it. And I've read comments on forums, especially, something that basically said something along the lines of, save your money. The E50 is good for just as anything more expensive, which could be true. And other comments saying, oh yeah, the DAC, really brought everything to life, and how, it made such a huge difference, and they love this DAC or they love that DAC, and, whatever. So, the short answer is, were my ears deceiving me, or were there actual differences? And the short answer is yes and no. First, I started by connecting my HE1000 HE1000 Stealth to this device. And I also had both DACs connected to my computer, and I was using this device to go back and forth from one headphone amp to the other. It's connected here to both of them. And on the computer, I had to manually select which DAC I was running. So when I would switch back and forth, with my left hand, I would switch this, and with my right on my mouse, I would switch with which on the computer. And so listening to the ADI 2, the bass was, it sounded a little bit more incisive, where it did feel a bit poofier on the topping. And starting around the 22-second mark of Ado's song Show, the bass beats come in, and, going back and forth between the two is very apparent that, the ADI was nicer. And, the sound felt, slightly more veiled on the topping, making the ADI sound more clear throughout. And then around the 2-minute mark of the show, there is a distorted bass that comes in, and it sounds cleaner on the ADI. And then around the 11-second mark of Super Shy by New Jeans, you can hear the details coming in a bit and on the ADI, the separation sounds more distinctive. And then that's when I realized that I had my EQ actually turned on the ADI. And so it wasn't a one-to-one comparison. As I said, I had the mids boosted a little bit. I had the 500 hertz boosted +1 and the 1000 hertz boosted +2, and somehow it made the overall, of course, it makes the vocal a little bit forward, but it made the overall song feel better separated and cleaner than without the EQ. And then also once I disabled the EQ, a lot of the differences disappeared. There were some differences, of course, depending on the song, and in many of the songs, I actually couldn't hear that much of a difference. But when it was different, the ADI was very subtly cleaner. It was a bit more alive, and the bass slightly better defined. But it was not very noticeable difference that I had heard with the EQ on. With the HE1000 stealths, Apate by Rose and Bruno Mars, Aro's Ae no Akuruhi, OK Wings #2 sounded remarkably similar, while something like IU's My C, her vocals came a bit more alive, a bit more. And for the most part, the difference was slight enough that I wouldn't be able to pick out which one is which in a blind A/B test. So that was with the headphones, but with the Crimsons, I could hear a little bit more difference in the bass texture. And once again, it wasn't much of a difference, but it was there. And I did prefer the bass on the RME for that. In I Use My C, once again, I could hear a slight difference in the vocals, where the vocals on the ADI sounded a little bit more alive. But it was just ever slightly so. The bass here also felt a little bit better. It's not a super bassy song, but there are some parts where the bass kind of comes in, and it did feel better. And and on the topping, everything sounded slightly flatter, right? So I think the difference is it's often going to come down to what headphones or what IEMs you're using with the stacks. Like listening to something like Loewe's California and Me, I could hear no difference between the tracks at all between the two. And so I felt like oftentimes the difference I was hearing was in like the upper ranges, right? Because IU's voice is very high. So like a lot of times I felt a lot of the vocals were were very similar when I was hearing them. But for somebody like IU who has a very high voice, there was some difference. And then I tested this as a DAC. So listening to my Verite closed through the Echo Mark II, using the ADI and the E50 as the DACs. So I had the L50 turned off. And when listening to Ado's Ae no Akuruhi, it sounded a little bit more emotional in this case. And like when the music is a little less dramatic, you don't hear the differences as much. Like OK Wings #2 is a much less dramatic song. It's pretty even throughout, right? And it's very relaxed. And so I could still hear minor differences, but not much. The topping just sounded a little bit like ever so slightly muffled throughout the song. In the beginning of IU Love Wins All, there's a piano part which is prominent, and there is a clarity in the ADI that stands out versus the topping. Once again, it's not a huge difference, but it's noticeable. And of course, when IU's voice starts, it sounds a bit more livelier. And so I felt like I heard the most difference on the Echo. I did not test the Verites on the solid state amps, because that would require changing pads on the Verites. And for any of you who own ZMFs, changing pads is not that fun. Because the pads that I have on there right now are the VE2 pads. And if I were to run them on solid state, they sound a lot better with their Universe pads, because the VE2s are a bit brighter. But because the warmth that is added, those pads on the tube amp sounds a little bit too like muffled, which I don't like. And so I did not test it, but it could also be that maybe the headphone is doing some of the work here, where the differences are. But I'm actually not sure. Then I also played the typical test tracks through the IEMA A70 and the Sonos Faber Lumina 2 speakers. The topping was connected through the RCAs and the RME through the XLRs. I volume matched them, allowing me to go back and forth. So once again, I had to choose the DAC on my computer, and then I can just switch which input by selecting this, pushing the button, and yeah. And surprisingly, I could not hear any difference between the two DACs. I was more worried that the RCA might reduce the sound quality versus the XLR, but that did not seem to be the case. Once I applied a little EQ, I could definitely hear the difference between the two, but otherwise it was really hard to find anything. Now, I think the Lumina 2s are not the most detailed speakers. And I'm also using a pretty cheap subwoofer just to add in a little bit of the low end. So maybe with a better setup, you would be able to hear a difference. Though I mean these speakers aren't cheap; they're 1,200 euros. But they're I think still considered mid range or possibly even on the cheaper end, depending on how you look at speaker and your budget. But I do like these speakers for the mids that they deliver, which is the area that seems often least impacted between the DACs. But even with IU's my C, I really couldn't hear a difference there. But when I was initially testing the RME, my first week of playing with it, I felt like everything was a little bit more alive. But I think that was kind of a placebo effect. And so it could matter a bit more depending on the type of speakers you had, right? You have, like I said, it also might make a difference depending on what headphones and IEMs you use. So possibly the speakers would also make a difference. So in conclusion, if you have EQ on your computer, which I don't because I'm generally listening on my work computer while I'm working during the day, and they're very strict about which software I can put in there. And if you are, but if you have EQ on your computer and you're just using it as a solid state, then I think you could save your money and get just the topping stack, right? It's not a huge difference, and depending on your setup, it's not a difference that you might appreciate, right? But I think, if you are using very sensitive IEMs or something like that, then it might be worth getting something like the RME or something even better, right? But I think that's not a huge population out there. So, the topping stack sounds great, and I probably would have never even considered upgrading had it not been for all these YouTube reviewers talking about how great some of these DACs are and things like that, right? But here we are. But if you're using this as a DAC to run something like the Echo, then I would consider a better DAC than the E50 because I felt like the differences were pronounced. But if I were just buying the DAC, then I might consider something a little bit cheaper, like the Topping E70V, I think, which uses the same chipset as the RME. But if you're considering getting a stack, right, where you have the amp, the DAC, and EQ, something like the shit stack, then the RME actually might be a good contender, right? Because for everything it does, right, $1,000 is actually, I think, a bargain, right? So, I picked this up used for about $630, $650, I forget, but yeah, and for that price, it was kind of a no-brainer for me. And so, as for most of you, who have spent thousands of dollars on audio gear, if not tens of thousands, we're often chasing that last 1% improvement in sound. I'm more searching for that 5%, and I think this delivers it for me, especially with the little EQ tweak that I do here. It really, livens things up, right? So for example, my other IEM set that I have now still is the Elysian Divas, right, which are over here. And the thing that the Elysian Divas do better than the Crimsons is the mid-range, right? The vocals just ever so slightly, because the vocals on the Crimson are phenomenal, but the Divas are just slightly better, right? And so I feel like with the slight EQ where I boost up the mids a little bit, I actually don't need to listen to the Divas anymore, because for everything else, the Crimsons are better, right? The treble, the bass, right? Yeah, and so for me, the RME is definitely worth it. Yeah, and with the same EQ, I like the sound coming out of my HE1000 Stealth even more. I was actually considering selling this because I was listening to mostly I was just listening to my Verite closed all the time. But with the small change, I've been spending a lot more time with these now, and it's giving my tubes a chance to take a break. And most of all, the little life that it adds to the Echo and to the Verites, it makes me very happy, right? And so to me, it's totally worth it. Would I go and buy an even more expensive, maybe something like R2R DAC or something like that? I don't think so. To me, this is enough. But yeah, so in conclusion, it really depends on what it is you're trying to get out of your system, and in which case then an upgrade to something like the ADI 2 DAC might be worth it for you. I hope you found this helpful. And to me it was interesting, and I think I will either be giving the topping stack to my kid or maybe selling it. But thank you, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Bye.